serious? What's a dark family secret you uncovered? I was the family secret. My biological parents started having kids as teenagers. For context, when my biological mom found out she was pregnant with me, she was 21 and I was their fourth child. They quickly realized they needed to get their act together. They were already struggling financially, had countless drug issues, etc. They decided that they were going to put me up for adoption. I was a baby. I was adopted by a loving family quite quickly, only about an hour drive from the city I was born in. Coincidentally, I ended up returning to that same city for college. My sophomore year, I decided to seek out my biological family. Turns out, my biological parents separated right after I was born. My biological mom is still in and out of jail to this day, but my biological dad was able to start a new chapter. He got clean and sober, remarried, started going to church, and built a legitimate career for himself. He told his new wife about me when they first met, but didn't tell any of his children. My other siblings didn't know I existed. Thanks to the internet, I ended up tracking down his work number and gave him a call. Later on, he said as soon as I said, "Hi, this might be really weird," but he knew it was me. Apparently, ever since I turned 18, him and his wife were waiting anxiously for me to resurface. They knew the day would come eventually. That evening, they sat my siblings down and told them about me. It was difficult at first, but now I'm 25 and me and him have a pretty solid relationship. My brother discovered we had a sister because he was hitting on a girl at the bar and they got to talking about their parents. Turns out we have the same dad. He threatens to kill me whenever I bring it up, lol. When I was a kid I knew my grandfather was odd. He'd call me his grandson even when I was wearing a dress and clearly female, but my parents would tell me to ignore it. Then I found out that when my dad was a kid, Grandpa sold my dad's sister Barbara to someone and kept my dad and his brother because he didn't want a girl in the family. My dad found his sister Barbara around the time I was in middle school via calling around to get records. They were reunited. She's my favorite aunt now. No one liked Grandpa. So turns out my mother was engaged to a guy. He went on a long family holiday to Europe. When he got back, my mum was with his best friend, my father. Uncle Joseph is very probably a serial killer, a major suspect for the West Mesa bone collector. He is also convicted as the middle school rapist. One day Joseph was just sort of out of the picture and no concrete answer was given why. At the time I was young enough that I didn't think to push or particularly wonder at the details. My grandpa doesn't know that his dad was hit and killed by a drunk driver. He was like 2 when his dad died and can't remember any of it. The only thing he said was that he thought it involved a truck. I found the article of my great grandfather's death when I started digging into my grandpa's family tree. I also found that great grandpa was the result of a teen pregnancy and was raised by his grandparents. I'd tell him but I'm not really sure there's too much point in bringing it up now. Great grandma ran a hotel in the late 1800s near a train depot and army fort in the Oklahoma Territory. Turns out it was a brothel. Great grandma was a madam. She must have been good at it cause she left a stack to my grandma. My aunt was recently arrested. Why? She got pulled over and they found out she had a warrant. She got sent to jail. They found meth in her car. Turns out, a large majority of people in my family are drug users. Also a ton of the adults in my family are apparently have molested some of my close cousins and family members. Makes me wonder which ones I can even trust anymore. Uncle met his wife during the time he was using drugs. She was a prostitute. They have 2 kids now and they're great parents. Wouldn't ever guess that they have rather dark pasts. They haven't let it visibly affect them. My dad was discharged from the military for going AWOL. He had found out his ex from when he was like 15 had his children back then and never told him about it. I have 2 siblings who are twins out there. I don't know their names or what they look like, but they're out there somewhere and they're only 3 years older than me. My father had a relationship with my mother's brother and almost got home kicked out of the Air Force. My grandfather tried to kill my dad with an axe, literally showed up to his place of work and went looking to cut him down. And somehow, my unprepared dad fought him off barehanded. So grandpa escaped and came back the next day to finish the job with a gun. But my dad didn't show up to work. So dude offed himself in the parking lot, leaving the itchiest suicide note ever. I've told the story a lot of times here, but I still can't completely grasp that it and the circus of other it that surrounded it were real. We have a set of plates our family uses only on Easter. My mom always fusses about that they are great grandmother. Pre-World War I family heirlooms. As someone who is interested in this kind of stuff, I looked up the maker's mark. 1940s kitsch. At best, I haven't told anyone because I have my eyes on another set of china. And I want to seem magnanimous when I compromise with my sister to have these. It's not uncovered yet, but my uncle killed himself after being wanted by the police. Very well planned out. He planned and paid for his own funeral, got all of his affairs in order, and hung himself. A proud, tough guy kind of guy. 2. The type who would think suicide is a coward's way out. Cops must have wanted him for something real bad. One rumor is child molestation or something. My uncle got his HS girlfriend pregnant and my grandmother drove her to the clinic for an abortion, agreeing to pay only if the GF didn't tell my uncle that she was going to abort his unborn child. It tore him up when he found out, but that hardly excuses his next actions. My mother gets pregnant by my father around this time and is not too discreetly offered the same deal, which my mother refuses with a few choice words. My uncle finds out, tracks my mother down, and punches her in the stomach for daring to take what was ripped away from him. My mother subsequently miscarried, who would have been my big brother. My mom, the saint she is, forgave him and tried to help him get some therapy. He rejected her help and joined the army instead. I didn't find out any of this until I was an adult, which really ducked with my head since my uncle had always been really close to me up until I came out of the closet. He somehow thought of me as the daughter his mother had aborted. My great aunt and uncle had a baby when they were still in the dating phase. They were in love and getting married was a sure thing down the line. However, coming from a very conservative society in the Middle East back in the 50s, they had to give the child away to an orphanage. Once that was done, they got married and eventually had 4 children. That child grew up knowing his origins and only allowed minimal contact with his family. He still isn't invited to family events and has a family of his own. When my great uncle passed away, I was told he was amongst the randoms that came to the cemetery to pay respects. None of my cousins, including myself, know what he looks like, but my dad and his siblings and cousins all do. It's sad how he's punished for something that isn't his fault. My one cool uncle came to our house every Christmas. Thanksgiving was always really great and pleasant. Had a bunch of cats and dogs at his house. Was married to my aunt shortly before I was born. So one day my mom and I went to visit him and my aunt at his house. And there's this girl there. I think she was a year older than me, so about 15. My mom and I are like, "Who's this girl?" And my uncle is like, "Well, I just found out a few days ago that I have a daughter. So, I guess this is your cousin." Turns out that before my uncle and aunt got married, my uncle had a pretty wild bachelor party in which a prostitute was hired. One thing led to another, and my cousin appears 15 years later to find her father. She was so sweet, and my uncle was actually really good about the whole situation. He even started paying child support to my cousin's mom. His idea. My aunt was also very forgiving. I've never met my cousin's mom. We had a cousin that died of AIDS a few years ago. At the funeral, people kept saying he was sick. He was getting better. He had been ill for over a year. It's sad that in this age people still stigmatize HIV+ individuals. Oh boy, here we go. My family could have been worth millions. My grandpa's father, my great-grandfather, had built a company from the ground up called Johnson Corrugated. We made corrugated cardboard for shipping boxes. Great-grandfather was a major D but had built the family empire, so we still see him in a good way. My grandfather was supposed to inherit the company 30-something years ago until Uncle Randy happened. My great-grandmother was still alive and was technically owner of the company. She was also blind and deaf. Uncle Randy comes in impersonating my grandfather and has her sign away the entire company over to him. He gives half of the $15 million to his son, who flees to Europe after the death threats. Randy dies within the month after fleeing the family from cancer. Nobody went to his funeral and we piss on his grave. Note, my grandpa is 80 and can retire because he's been fighting this in court for the past 20 years and else about 300,000 in legal fees. Duck Randy. I found this out after stumbling into a stack of legal documents in my grandpa's attic. We still don't know where Randy's son is to this day. My great aunt was a nurse at a mental hospital about 100 years ago. She fell in love with a guy who had been committed there by the state. She helped him escape and they ran off together to another part of the country. Turns out the guy was a psycho murderer and he got extradited back and put in prison. My aunt, a sweet old soul, lived to be 99 years old and I never knew anything about her past until decades after she was gone. Well, dad's a pedophile and my brother and I were the secret in my mom's family for a while. I imagine that was a fun conversation for her to have. Explaining to our half siblings that hey, you have these older siblings because I used to be married to a piece of it and then I abandoned them because I'm also a piece of it. My paternal grandfather was a D-head. Cheated on his wife like it was a job. Had so many kids he literally didn't know how many he had. An estimate was about 35-40 and this was in the 80s. The youngest one is now 18 years old. The oldest one, my pops, is 64. As if cheating weren't bad enough. He also beat his wife and neglected his 2 legitimate kids. Thankfully my dad turned out quite well and he's a loving father. There's a lot of skepticism over whether or not she's actually his kid though. I found out one of my aunts had an arranged marriage. She wasn't the one who was supposed to be in the arranged marriage, but her sister was adamant against marrying the dude. And I guess my grandma decided to persuade my aunt into replacing the sister's part of the marriage. Aunt and the dude got married and moved away, and had kids. They lived far away so I barely ever saw them but only as I got older did I learn that the dude was abusive to my aunt. To the point where she still had some intense mental breakdowns long after he died. My dad's sister wasn't his sibling at all. It was his cousin as the aunt was super religious and wouldn't have tolerated a teenage pregnancy. So his aunt gave her daughter to my grandparents and they raised her as her own. Found that out not too long ago. Not that big of a deal. But it was pretty sour inducing. My uncle had a bastard child. When this child grew up, they discovered they're my grandfather and would call multiple times a month with some sob story for money. Being the absolutely kind-hearted, yet unbelievably gullible man he was, my grandfather gave in almost every time. One year my uncle dropped off the map. Couldn't call him. No one where he was. His family genuinely thought the worst. Well, the kid calls saying he's dead and wants their inheritance, as well as whatever inheritance he would have gotten from my grandparents' will. This drove the family absolutely mad with grief and rage. Eventually the kid even started threatening to get a lawyer for their due. Uncle showed up one day. Turned out he ran out of money and got in trouble with some banks. So started hopping between towns. Kid dropped the lawsuit. And no one in my family let their kids talk to that cousin. I only ever met them at my grandfather's funeral. My dad's brother cheated on his wife with my dad's wife, not my mom, and then killed himself. We were always told it was an accidental death, not suicide. Another. My dad's cousin who is boomer Mr. Christian cheated on his wife with several women while on a mission trip in Africa with his church. And filmed it all on the family camcorder in the 90s. Years later he gave the tape to his daughter to watch forgetting it was on there.